Midnight, Indian Territory. 1878. A black man rides alone through the darkness, his Winchester rifle resting across the saddle. Behind him, 5 miles back, a group of armed men are tracking his every move. They're not lawmen. They're bounty hunters. And they've been promised $2,000 in gold to bring back his body. The man they're hunting knows they're coming. He's known for 3 days. And what happens in the next hour will become one of the most erased stories in American frontier history. Because when those bounty hunters finally caught up to Bass Reeves, they didn't collect their reward. They ended up in chains, delivered to Fort Smith in irons by the very man they've been paid to kill. This is the story they never wanted you to know. The story of a black deputy marshal who had the largest bounty ever placed on a lawman's head in the Wild West. A man who survived over 30 assassination attempts. A man who arrested more than 3,000 criminals, killed 14 in self-defense, and was never once shot in his entire career. They put a price on Bass Reeves' head. What happened next didn't just shock Fort Smith. It rewrote everything we think we know about justice, race, and power in the American frontier. The year is 1838. In Crawford County, Arkansas, a baby is born into slavery on the plantation of William Reeves, a white state legislator. That baby is named Bass. For the first 25 years of his life, he exists as property. He's taught to work, to obey, to disappear into the background of white society. But he's also learning something his enslavers don't realize. He's watching. He's memorizing the land, the trails, the hiding spots in the vast wilderness just beyond the plantation borders. He's becoming one of the greatest trackers the American West will ever produce. And his masters have no idea they're training their future nightmare. When the Civil War erupts in 1861, Bass Reeves sees his chance. The historical record is murky here, possibly deliberately so. Some accounts say he escaped after a violent confrontation with his enslaver. Others say he simply walked off during the chaos of war. What we know for certain is this. Bass Reeves fled into Indian Territory, the lawless expanse that would become Oklahoma, and he vanished completely. For 4 years, while America tore itself apart over slavery, a fugitive black man lived among the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations. He learned their languages. He mastered their tracking techniques. He became so skilled at moving unseen through hostile territory that indigenous hunters considered him supernatural. Think about what was happening here. A man born as property was transforming himself into something unprecedented, something dangerous, something that would one day terrify every outlaw west of the Mississippi River. The war ends in 1865. 4 million black Americans are declared free. But you already know what happens next, don't you? Freedom on paper means nothing when former Confederates are reorganizing to restore white supremacy through terror. The Ku Klux Klan rises, reconstruction struggles, and in the territories, a different kind of chaos erupts. Indian Territory becomes the most dangerous place in America. With no local law enforcement and minimal federal presence, it attracts every murderer, bank robber, horse thief, and fugitive fleeing justice elsewhere. Conservative estimates suggest over 100,000 wanted criminals hide in the territory during this period. It's a no-man's land, where the strong prey on the weak, and justice is whatever you can enforce at gunpoint. But in 1875, everything changes. President Ulysses S. Grant appoints Isaac C. Parker as the federal judge for the Western District of Arkansas. With jurisdiction over Indian Territory, Parker will become known as the hanging judge, sentencing over 160 men to death during his 21 years on the bench. But Parker understands something crucial. Justice means nothing without enforcement. He needs men willing to ride into that hellscape and drag criminals back alive. He needs deputy marshals, and not the usual type. He needs men who can survive in territories so hostile that the average deputy life expectancy is measured in months. Parker starts recruiting, and almost immediately, his marshals start dying. In his first year alone, he loses 11 deputies to outlaws. The criminals aren't just resisting arrest. They're hunting lawmen for sport. Killing a federal officer has become a badge of honor among the territory's worst elements. And then someone brings Parker a name, Bass Reeves. A black man living near the territory border. A man who speaks multiple indigenous languages fluently. A man who knows Indian territory better than almost anyone alive. A man with a reputation for being absolutely fearless and almost impossible to track. Parker doesn't hesitate. In 1875, he commissions Bass Reeves as a deputy United States Marshal, making him one of the first black federal lawmen west of the Mississippi River. Let me ask you something. Can you imagine what this meant? A man who had been enslaved just a decade earlier was now legally authorized to arrest white men. He carried federal warrants. He wore the badge of the United States government. He had the power to kick down doors, to draw weapons, and to haul anyone regardless of race before the hanging judge himself. White supremacists across the frontier absolutely could not accept this. A black man with a badge? A black man with the legal authority to arrest their kind? It violated everything they believed about the natural order of the world. And when Bass Reeves started making arrests, their disbelief turned to rage. Because Reeves wasn't just good at his job. He was the best deputy Parker ever had. His first ride into Indian territory set the pattern. Where other marshals traveled in groups for protection, Reeves often rode alone. Where others announced themselves and demanded surrender, Reeves used disguises and deception. He'd enter outlaw camps dressed as a farmer, a tramp, a fellow fugitive. He'd share meals with wanted men, learn their secrets, earn their trust. And then, at the perfect moment, he'd reveal the badge and the warrants. The stories started spreading within months. Bass Reeves once dressed as a beggar and approached a farmhouse where 2 murderers were hiding. The outlaws, thinking him harmless, let him warm himself by their fire. They fed him. They laughed at his apparent poverty. They never noticed him studying the layout of the house, counting their weapons, planning his move. When he pulled his pistols and announced himself as a federal officer, they were so stunned that they surrendered without a shot. He marched them 28 miles to the nearest jail, on foot with their own guns in his belt. Here's something they don't teach in history class. Bass Reeves had physical abilities that bordered on legendary. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds of muscle. He could shoot ambidextrously with equal accuracy. He once entered a quick-draw competition where marksmen fired at moving targets, and he hit all of his while the white competitors missed most of theirs. People who witnessed his shooting described it as almost mechanical in its precision. One deputy who rode with him wrote that Reeves could draw and fire before most men could blink, but his greatest weapon wasn't his guns. It was his mind. Reeves understood that the most dangerous outlaws couldn't be taken by force. They had to be outsmarted. He developed a network of informants across Indian territory. Indigenous communities who remembered his years among them. Black settlers who saw him as their protector. Even some outlaws who feared him too much to refuse information. He gathered intelligence the way a spider gathers flies, patiently, relentlessly. And when he finally moved, his targets rarely saw him coming. Within 3 years of pinning on the badge, Bass Reeves had arrested more fugitives than any other deputy in the district. Hundreds of men. Murderers who'd evaded capture for years. Gang leaders who controlled entire regions through terror. Horse thieves who'd built small empires. He brought them all to Fort Smith, and that's when the threats began. The first bounty appeared around 1878. We don't know exactly who posted it, but the message spread through every saloon and hideout in the territory. $2,000 for Bass Reeves, dead or alive. Think about what that amount meant in 1878. The average annual wage for a working man was maybe $400. $2,000 was 5 years of income. It was life-changing money. It was enough to tempt almost anyone into becoming an assassin, and the people posting it knew exactly what they were doing. Word reached Fort Smith within days. Judge Parker called Reeves into his chambers. History doesn't record the exact conversation, but we know the outcome. Parker offered to reassign Reeves to safer duties, maybe court security, maybe administrative work, something that wouldn't put him in constant danger. Reeves refused. According to accounts from other deputies, his response was simple. If he stopped riding, the outlaws would know their tactics worked. Every black lawman in America would become a target for bounty hunters. The threats would multiply. Justice would retreat. Reeves understood something that many people still don't grasp. You can't negotiate with terrorism. You can only defeat it. He rode out the next morning, alone, into territory where every pair of eyes might belong to someone dreaming of $2,000 in gold. And this is where the story gets incredible. If you're enjoying learning about Bass Reeves, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. The assassination attempts started almost immediately. The first one came 3 weeks after the bounty was posted. Reeves was camped near the Canadian River when he heard horses approaching in the darkness. Most men would have fled. Most men would have hidden. Reeves extinguished his fire, moved 30 yards into the brush, and waited. 4 riders entered his camp, guns drawn. They searched his bedroll. They kicked through his supplies. They never noticed the man watching them from the shadows, his rifle trained on the leader's chest. When Reeves announced himself, 2 of the riders wheeled to fire. He dropped both before they could squeeze their triggers. The other 2 surrendered. He marched all 4 of them, including the wounded, back to Fort Smith. When asked about the incident, Reeves reportedly said he was more annoyed about losing a night's sleep than worried about the attack. But the attempts didn't stop. They escalated. Within a year, Reeves had survived at least 7 direct assassination attempts. Snipers firing from ridgelines missed him by inches. Poisoned food offered by seemingly friendly settlers made his horse sick but never reached his lips. Outlaws who challenged him to draws died before clearing leather. Each failed attempt added to his legend and added to the frustration of those who'd posted the bounty. They were spending money. They were recruiting killers. And the Black Marshal kept riding, kept arresting, kept delivering prisoners to Fort Smith as if he were invincible. Here's a detail that historians often overlook. Bass Reeves' survival wasn't luck. It was strategy. He never slept in the same place twice. He varied his routes constantly. He developed an almost supernatural ability to sense ambush before they sprung. Other deputies described riding with him as eerie. He would suddenly change direction for no apparent reason, and hours later, they'd learned that outlaws had been waiting on their original path. He had sources everywhere. Indigenous trackers who owed him favors. Black families in remote homesteads who watched the trails. Even some white settlers who'd seen him bring order to lawless regions and now supported him in secret. The entire territory was his intelligence network, and he used it ruthlessly. By 1880, the bounty on Bass Reeves' head had become a joke among the deputies at Fort Smith, not because it wasn't real, but because collecting it seemed impossible. The men who tried kept ending up dead or in chains. The irony was devastating to those who'd posted it. Every assassin they sent after Reeves ended up increasing his arrest numbers. Every ambush attempt he survived added to his reputation. They were literally funding his legend with their own blood and money. Let me tell you about one specific incident that captures the entire dynamic. In 1882, a gang leader named Jim Webb decided to collect the bounty personally. Webb was no amateur. He'd killed at least 3 men and had eluded federal officers for years. He gathered 6 of his most trusted men and set out to find Bass Reeves. They tracked him for 2 weeks, following reports of his movements through the territory. Finally, they located him near the Creek Nation border, camped alone by a small stream. 7 armed men against 1. The odds seemed overwhelming. Webb approached at dawn, confident of victory. What happened next became one of the most retold stories in frontier history. Reeves had known about the pursuit for days. His informants had warned him that Webb was coming. Instead of fleeing, he'd chosen his campsite specifically for this confrontation. The stream was at his back, eliminating any approach from that direction. The trees provided cover. The rising sun would be in his attacker's eyes. When Webb and his men charged, Reeves was ready. He killed 2 in the first exchange of fire. A third went down trying to flee. Webb himself was shot through the shoulder and leg. The remaining 3 surrendered immediately, throwing down their weapons and begging for mercy. And here's the part that shocked Fort Smith. Reeves didn't execute them. He treated Webb's wounds. He fed the survivors from his own supplies. And then he loaded all of them, including the dead, onto their own horses and began the long journey back to federal custody. When he arrived in Fort Smith, dragging the man who tried to kill him for bounty money, the crowd that gathered was enormous. Black residents celebrated openly. White officials stood in stunned silence. And outlaws throughout the territory heard the message loud and clear. You don't hunt Bass Reeves. He hunts you. The bounties started disappearing after that. Not officially, but practically. Word spread that trying to collect was suicide. The men who'd posted the original rewards quietly stopped talking about them. Some even fled the territory entirely, terrified that Reeves might come for them next. Think about the reversal here. The people who had placed a price on a black lawman's head were now running from him. The hunters had become the hunted. And Bass Reeves just kept riding, kept arresting, kept delivering justice, as if nothing unusual had happened. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more remarkable. The threats against Reeves weren't just criminal. They were racial. Many of the outlaws who wanted him dead were former Confederates, white supremacists, who couldn't stand the idea of a black man with authority over them. Some had clan connections. Others simply believed that any black man who dared enforce law against whites deserved death on principle. The bounty wasn't just about stopping a dangerous lawman. It was about sending a message that black people who rose too high would be destroyed. Reeves understood this completely, and his response was devastating. He didn't just survive their attempts. He humiliated them. He arrested white outlaws and marched them through towns where residents watched a black man in authority bring white criminals to justice. He used his success to prove that their entire worldview was a lie. Every prisoner he delivered was evidence that black Americans could not only match white abilities, but exceed them. Every assassination attempt he survived demonstrated that their assumptions about black weakness were fantasies. He was a one-man refutation of everything white supremacy claimed to believe. And the federal government, for this brief window of history, backed him completely. Judge Parker never wavered in his support. He gave Reeves the most dangerous assignments specifically because he knew Reeves would complete them. He defended Reeves against complaints from white criminals and their families who protested being arrested by a black man. He made it clear that in his jurisdiction, the law was colorblind, and anyone who resisted a federal deputy, regardless of that deputy's race, would face the full weight of his court. This alliance between a white judge and a black marshal terrified the outlaws more than anything else. It suggested that the racial hierarchy they depended on might actually be breakable, that power could shift, that their world might change. Let me give you some numbers that put Reeves' achievement in perspective. During his 32 years as a deputy marshal, he arrested over 3,000 felons. He served more than 3,000 warrants. He rode thousands of miles through some of the most dangerous territory in North America. He was shot at countless times. His belt was shot off his body. His hat was shot from his head. His bridle reins were shot out of his hands. But he himself was never wounded. Not once. Over 3 decades of the most dangerous law enforcement work imaginable, and he never took a bullet. Do you understand how statistically impossible that should be? Other deputies in his district died at rates that would horrify any modern police department. Reeves just kept surviving, kept riding, kept winning. It wasn't luck. It was mastery. And here's something that will change how you think about American history. Many historians now believe that Bass Reeves was the original inspiration for the Lone Ranger. Think about it. A masked lawman who tames the Wild West, exceptional riding and shooting skills. A Native American companion who helps him track criminals. An almost mythical ability to always defeat the bad guys. Sound familiar? The Lone Ranger was created in 1933, just 23 years after Reeves' death. The creators never officially acknowledged Reeves as an inspiration, but the parallels are overwhelming. The most iconic hero of the American West might have been based on a black man whose story was deliberately erased to make way for a white fictional replacement. Subscribe if you liked this video, because understanding what really happened in history matters now more than ever. But here's where the story takes a turn that few people expect. In 1902, Bass Reeves faced the most difficult test of his entire career, and it had nothing to do with bounty hunters or assassination attempts. His own son, Benjamin Reeves, was accused of murdering his wife. The evidence was substantial. Witnesses had come forward. A warrant was issued, and someone had to bring Benjamin Reeves to justice. Bass Reeves volunteered for the assignment himself. Think about what that meant. A father tracking his own son for murder. A man who had devoted his life to justice, now having to apply it to his own blood. Other marshals offered to take the case. They told Reeves no one would blame him for stepping aside. He refused. He said the law had to be impartial, and if he made exceptions for family, everything he'd built would mean nothing. He tracked his son for 2 weeks. He arrested him personally. He brought him to Fort Smith in irons, just like any other prisoner. Benjamin Reeves was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A man who had survived dozens of assassination attempts, who had been the target of the largest bounty ever placed on a lawman, who had defeated every enemy the Wild West threw at him. And his hardest moment was choosing the law over his own child. That's not just dedication. That's a moral conviction so deep it defies comprehension. Bass Reeves believed in justice, not as a convenience or a profession, but as a sacred calling that couldn't be compromised for anyone, not even family. His career continued for another 5 years after his son's arrest. He kept riding. He kept arresting. But time was catching up. In 1907, Oklahoma became a state, and the old federal marshal system was replaced by local law enforcement. Reeves was too old for the new police forces, but they gave him one final assignment. He became a police officer in Muskogee, Oklahoma, walking a beat at age 68. Even then, crime reportedly dropped in his patrol area. Outlaws who had evaded capture for years suddenly turned themselves in rather than face him. His reputation preceded him everywhere. Bass Reeves died on January 12, 1910. He was 71 years old. His funeral in Muskogee was attended by hundreds of people, black and white alike. Local newspapers praised him as one of the greatest lawmen in Western history. And then something happened that should make you angry. Within a generation, he was almost completely forgotten. Here's what they did. The same forces that had tried to kill Bass Reeves with bullets eventually succeeded in killing him with silence. History books mentioned the hanging judge, but not his greatest deputy. Western novels celebrated white marshals while ignoring the black man who outperformed them all. Movies and television shows created fictional heroes inspired by Reeves' exploits, but gave the credit to white characters. For nearly a century, the most successful lawman of the American frontier was erased from popular memory. They couldn't beat him, so they pretended he never existed. And why? You already know the answer. Bass Reeves' story destroyed too many comfortable narratives. The idea that the West was won by white heroes. The belief that black Americans were passive during the struggle for equality. The assumption that law and order were were white institutions that black people merely benefited from. Reeves disproved all of it. He was the law. He imposed order. He defeated enemies that white marshals couldn't handle. His very existence was an argument that white supremacy couldn't refute, so they simply stopped talking about him. But here's the thing about suppressed history. It has a way of coming back. In the last 20 years, Bass Reeves has been rediscovered by historians, writers, and filmmakers. Books have been written about him. Movies are in production. His grave has become a pilgrimage site for people who want to honor what he accomplished. The man who survived every assassination attempt is finally surviving the assassination of his memory. So the next time someone tells you that the Wild West was white history, that black Americans were only victims in the struggle for justice, that heroes look a certain way and come from certain backgrounds, remember Bass Reeves. Remember the enslaved child who became the most feared lawman west of the Mississippi. Remember the deputy who had the largest bounty ever placed on his head and turned every bounty hunter into a prisoner. Remember the father who chose the law over his own son because he believed justice couldn't have exceptions. They put a price on Bass Reeves' head. What happened next shocked Fort Smith. The man they tried to kill became unkillable. The badge they tried to silence became louder. The legacy they tried to bury is rising from the ground. Because here's the truth that outlaws and white supremacists learned the hard way. The truth that history books tried to hide for a century. You don't hunt Bass Reeves. He hunts you. And in the end, he always brings you in. That's the history they never wanted you to know. That's the story of the greatest lawman in American frontier history. A black man, an escaped slave. A deputy marshal who rode alone into hell and came back with prisoners. His name was Bass Reeves. And now that you know his story, it can never be erased again. Subscribe if you liked this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear the truth. And the next time you see a Western that only shows white heroes, remember the man who proved them all wrong. Bass Reeves. The law of the territory. Unkillable, unbreakable, unforgettable.